Tonight, beneath a sky the color of deep ink and winter starlight, we stepped quietly into a world far older than our own world, where humble medieval peasants faced the coldest nights with little more than firelight, wool, and one another. Our hook begins here, on a frost-bitten evening. A small village prepares for a chill so intense that even the trees seem to hold their breath. Yet within this cold lies warmth, resilience, and the gentle rhythm of life long ago. Before we begin, if you're listening from the US, late at night, or from Europe in the early morning, or from Canada at a cozy evening hour, or anywhere else in the world, in whatever time your clock reads, I invite you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where and when you're watching. It helps our peaceful stories reach more listeners across the quiet hours of the world. Now, take a moment to settle in, adjust your blanket, let your shoulders drop, let the air around you soften, breathe slowly, gently, prepare yourself for a journey into warmth, hearthlight, and the ancient calm of winter nights. And now, we return to the story. The last traces of daylight faded behind the rolling hills, leaving the medieval village wrapped in a dim, silvery gloaming. Snow had begun to fall in soft, unhurried flakes, each one drifting as though it carried its own tiny lantern of pale winter glow. The cottages, low and humble, formed a crooked line along a narrow dirt path, now frosted over and padded with quiet white. Inside one such cottage lived a small family, already preparing for what they knew would be one of the coldest nights of the season. Their home was made of timber and wattle, its thatched roof heavy with snow, but strong enough to hold. The walls creaked softly as the night wind brushed against them, as though whispering its icy greetings through the tiny cracks and seams. The hearth crackled gently, sending curling ribbons of warm orange light along the uneven stone floor. It wasn't a roaring firewood, had to be rationed carefully, but it was steady, dependable, the kind of fire that felt alive in its own quiet way. Shadows danced slowly along the walls, stretching and shrinking like drowsy spirits stirred by the flames. A pot hung low over the embers, releasing a faint aroma of boiled root vegetables and herbs collected during autumn's last mild days. The scent was not rich or extravagant, just simple, comforting, familiar. A woven mat lay near the hearth where the youngest child sat, huddled beneath a woolen blanket that had been mended countless times, each stitch a fragment of care. Outside, the cold deepened, settling over the village like a heavy quilt of ice. Yet inside, the soft murmur of the fire, the gentle shuffle of wool garments, and the slow rhythm of breathing created a cocoon of warmth. Peasants had long learned that survival wasn't just about wood or walls, it was about creating small pockets of comfort, tiny sanctuaries against the vast winter night. The father knelt near the hearth, rotating a thick, smoothed log to ensure it burned evenly. His hands, calloused and worn from years of labor, moved steadily and without hurry. The mother folded blankets made of rough-spun wool, laying them out in layers upon the shared sleeping area. Each layer, though humble, helped trap warmth, building a nest of fabric and care. Above them, hanging herbs rustled faintly as a draught swept through the cottage. Lavender, sage, and dried grasses, once fragrant in summer, now offered a soft, lingering reminder of sunlit days long past. The mixture of warm air rising from the hearth and the faint herbal scent created a soothing, almost dreamlike atmosphere. Outside, the snow fell thicker, muting every sound. The entire village seemed to slip into stillness. No hooves, no footsteps, no chatter, just the hush of winter's breath, settling over rooftops and fields. Inside the cottage, the family gathered closer, their quiet movements forming a slow, sleep-friendly rhythm. A rhythm as ancient as winter itself. The fire had settled into a steady glow, its embers pulsing softly like the quiet heartbeat of the cottage. As the night deepened, the warmth it offered became even more precious. The wind outside shifted, brushing lightly against the thatched roof, sending a faint rustle through the bundled reeds. It was not a harsh wind, just the sigh of winter passing by, curious but distant, as though it merely wished to look in on the families tucked inside. The father rose slowly from the hearth, stretching his back as though unfolding from a long day's work. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic in their slowness. In the cold months, everything softened into calm gestures, nothing wasted, nothing rushed. He moved toward the corner where the family's firewood was stacked, a small pile of carefully chosen, thoroughly dried logs. Every piece was a treasure. Every piece was the difference between a bitter night and a bearable one. He selected one more log, placing it gently atop the fire so as not to disturb the peaceful crackle. The flames welcomed it with a low sigh, curling around the wood with patient warmth. Light flickered across the room, glinting off the iron pot and shimmering faintly on the woven blanket hung over a drafty gap in the wall. Near the hearth, the mother arranged a bundle of straw and wool padding that served as bedding. She smoothed it carefully, pressing down gently with the flats of her palms. The smell of dried grass rose softly into the air, a warm, earthy scent that blended with the aroma of simmering stew. It evoked memories of late summer harvests, of sunlight on golden fields, of days when warmth was abundant and taken for granted. The children gathered closer, their cheeks flushed from the fire's glow. One of them traced shapes in the air above the flames, following the drifting sparks with drowsy eyes. Another curled into a ball under a blanket, listening to the rhythmic snap of burning wood. In the calm of the cottage, the family found comfort in togetherness. On nights like this, survival was as much about companionship as it was about warmth. Above them, the ceiling beams, darkened by years of smoke, held bunches of hanging herbs and braided garlic, gently swaying in the faint air currents. The shadows cast by the flames danced across the bundles, giving the illusion of slow, gentle swaying even when the air was still. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake settling into the hush that blanketed the village. The weight of the night pressed softly on the world, muffling even the smallest sounds. Yet the cold, though sharp, was kept at bay by the warmth of the hearth and the closeness of the family gathered around it. The mother ladled a small portion of stew into wooden bowls, the steam curling upward in delicate wisps. The broth was thin, but its warmth seeped into chilled hands and empty stomachs alike, offering comfort beyond its modest ingredients. The family ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, letting the warmth spread through them as gently as the firelight spreading across the room. In the far corner, a simple wooden chest held spare linens and a few handmade tools. Even the objects in the room seemed to embrace the atmosphere of stillness and quiet endurance. Every surface, every shadow, every flicker of light contributed to the sense of sanctuary. As their meal finished, the fire settled into a new rhythm, its glow steady and serene. The room felt wrapped in a soft cocoon of warmth. The cold outside reduced to a distant memory. The night was long, but the village had survived countless winters before, and within the soft amber aura of the hearth, they would survive this one too. As the last traces of warmth from their simple meal lingered in their hands, the family began the slow, familiar ritual of readying their cottage for the coldest stretch of the night. Outside, the snow fell in a gentler rhythm, now lighter flakes drifting lazily through the dark, settling into the deepening softness of the village. The night no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a quiet visitor who moved respectfully across the land. Inside, the hearth glowed with a warm orange steadiness. The fire was neither fierce nor strong, but it was loyal, its flames curling gracefully around the newest log, spreading sleepy light along the walls. Shadows rose and fell in rhythmic waves, almost like the room was breathing. The mother reached for a thick woolen curtain hanging near the door. It was heavy and slightly rough, woven from sheep's wool collected during the warmer months. She drew it across the wooden entrance, sealing in warmth and preventing drafts from sneaking into the room. The fabric fell into place with a muted rustle, and almost instantly the air inside felt calmer, more insulated, as though the cottage itself had pulled a blanket around its shoulders. The father moved next to the tiny window, really, just a narrow slit in the wall, covered with oiled parchment, stretched taut between wooden frames. The parchment let in a faint ghost of moonlight, but blocked the worst of the wind. Still, he pressed a small wall pad along the lower edge to stop a thin thread of cold air from slipping in. Little adjustments like this made a world of difference on winter nights. Survival happened in small details, quiet foresight, and practiced care. The children were already preparing their sleeping area. They arranged the straw bedding, fluffing it gently to let pockets of warm air settle between the layers. Over it they spread wool blankets, each one slightly different, one striped, one patched, one frayed at the edges yet still warm. They layered them carefully, smoothing them down so that no cold draft could slip beneath. A small clay lamp flickered on a low wooden shelf, adding another soft source of light. The flame shimmered behind the thin clay walls, casting a golden halo onto the nearby wooden bowl and the dried herbs hanging above. It wasn't bright, but the glow was comforting warm light in a world that could so easily turn cold and dark. Near the hearth, the mother checked the pot again. She lifted it briefly from the embers before setting it aside, letting the glowing coals settle into a gentle shimmer. The air above them shimmered faintly with warmth. She added a pinch of dried mint to the air, crumbling a small leaf between her fingers. Its scent rose subtly, blending with the earthy aroma of dried straw and the faint sweetness of smoldering wood. The father sat down heavily on a low stool and removed his boots, sturdy leather, cracked with age, but well cared for. He placed them upside down by the wall to keep them from stiffening in the cold. His thick wool socks, hand-knitted and uneven, steamed faintly near the fire. The warmth crept slowly into his tired feet, melting away the memory of frozen ground. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing gently against the cottage walls. It wasn't a harsh sound, just a soft, wandering sigh that moved from one corner of the village to the other. The snow muffled everything, draping the world in layers of silence. Even the farm animals in the distant barn had settled down, their soft breaths rising in slow, steady clouds. Inside the cottage, the family's preparations came to a peaceful close. Everything was arranged, sealed, tucked, and warmed. Their small home glowed like a lantern in the dark countryside, fragile but determined, a quiet testament to human resilience. They gathered together in the gentle hearthlight, drawing comfort from one another as the deep night approached. The worst of the cold might linger outside, but here within their walls, warmth had taken root. The night had settled fully now, stretching across the village like a long velvety cloak. Inside the cottage, warmth pulsed softly from the hearth, but beyond its glow, the world lay wrapped in winter's stillness. The snow, freshly fallen and untouched, reflected the gentle shimmer of moonlight, making the fields appear as if they were blanketed in powdered silver. From within their cozy shelter, the family could hear faint sounds from the world outside, small, careful noises that broke the hush just enough to remind them that life continued beyond their walls, even in the coldest hours. Somewhere near the edge of the field, an owl released a low, elongated hoot. It echoed softly across the open space, neither alarming nor loud, just a calm declaration of its presence. Medieval peasants often considered owls to be watchful, guardians of the night, creatures that understood darkness better than humans ever could. Tonight, its voice seemed to soothe the silence rather than disturb it. A moment later, the faint crunch of snow announced the movement of a small animal, perhaps a fox, thin and agile, stepping delicately along the boundary where the village met the wilderness. Foxes knew how to survive these nights, slipping through shadows, moving with practiced grace. The villagers often admired them quietly for their winter wisdom. The father paused for a moment, listening. He recognized the soft patterns of the fox's movements, and his eyes drifted toward the shuttered window. Though he could not see it, he imagined the creature's silhouette gliding across the starlit fields, its paws making tiny impressions in the snow. Nature endured the cold in its own ways, and in observing it even through the thin veil of sound, the family felt connected to something larger and ancient. Farther out, the trees at the forest's edge stood silent and tall, their branches weighted with snow. The pines carried a comforting scent that drifted faintly on the occasional breeze, even reaching the village sometimes when the wind turned just right. Tonight, that fragrance lingered in the air, a crisp, woody calmness that mingled with the warmth and herbs inside the cottage. The mother glanced toward the doorway curtain, as though sensing the world beyond. She knew the land well, the way deer would shelter deep in the forest thickets, the way birds tucked themselves into hollow trunks or huddled beneath branches. She imagined them now, nestled into their own quiet corners of the night, all creatures from sparrows to oxen finding small ways to stay warm until dawn. Inside, the fire crackled softly, a gentle counterpoint to the muffled sounds outside. The children listened, their eyes drowsy but alert enough to notice the tiny symphony of winter night creatures. They found comfort in knowing they weren't alone. In the vast stillness, everything living had its own fragile but resilient place in the winter world. The father reached down and adjusted one of the blankets, tucking its corner more securely beneath the straw bedding. The mother dimmed the small clay lamp by reducing the wick's flame until it gave off just the faintest glow, enough to shape soft shadows on the wall but not enough to disturb the room's growing serenity. Gradually, the sounds outside grew quieter as the night deepened. The fox moved on. The owl settled into its vigil. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A soft calm stretched across the landscape, threading through the trees, over the rooftops, and finally settling inside the humble cottage. The family relaxed into the quiet, letting the stillness wash over them like a blanket. The world was cold, but it was peaceful, gentle, in its own stark winter way. And within that peace, the cottage felt even warmer, a tiny island of comfort in a vast sea of snow. As the night stretched deeper, the cottage's small world of warmth took on a softer, more hushed quality. The fire continued its gentle glow, illuminating the room with a quiet steadiness, but now its light felt subdued, as though it too were preparing for the deeper hours ahead. The embers pulsed faintly bright, then dim like the slow rhythm of a lantern breathing. The family began settling into their shared sleeping space, a routine shaped by many winters and refined by necessity. In the medieval world, warmth was precious, and the surest way to preserve it was to gather close. Layer upon layer, people and blankets and straw created a nest where heat could collect and linger through the darkest hours. The mother spread the last wool blanket across the bedding, smoothing it with practiced hands. The fabric was dense and slightly scratchy, woven from the wool of their own sheep animals, whose thick coats provided warmth both in life and long after shearing. This blanket, though worn at the edges, carried the faint scent of lanolin and late summer fields. It had seen many winters and would see many more. The children climbed into the bedding first, curling into the straw and creating small pockets of warmth with their bodies. Straw, though simple, was a remarkable insulator. Each hollow stalk held air within it, trapping heat that slowly accumulated until the bedding felt like a soft, warm cradle. They pulled the patched blankets up to their chins, their movements slow and contented. The father settled next, easing himself down with a quiet exhale. The weight of the day seemed to leave his body as he lay beside his family. His presence added both warmth and reassurance, for nothing in the cold months mattered more than the safety and closeness of those around him. Beside him, the mother lowered herself gently onto the bedding, adjusting her shawl before tucking it beneath the top blanket. She reached out and brushed a loose lock of hair from her youngest child's forehead, a tender gesture that spoke of as much warmth as the fire itself. Once everyone was nestled, the father lifted the final layer, a heavy sheepskin, thick and soft, its wool dense enough to trap heat even when the air grew icy. He draped it over all of them, letting it fall in gentle folds that settled like a comforting embrace. The sheepskin's warmth emerged almost immediately, enveloping them in a cocoon that protected against even the harshest winter chill. The fire crackled softly, sending a warm thread of light across their faces. Though the flames had grown lower, they still cast a gentle glow over the room, illuminating the hanging herbs, the wooden beams above, and the faint wisps of steam rising from the cooling pot. The mother shifted slightly, ensuring the children were nestled securely between them where warmth would be greatest. Her movements were slow and soothing. The father adjusted the sheepskin one more time, tucking its edges so no cold air could creep beneath it. Outside, the night pressed colder. Frost formed intricate patterns on the shuttered window, curling and branching like delicate white feathers, but the family felt only the steady comfort of shared heat. Their breaths mingled softly, rising into the air in warm puffs that quickly blended into the cozy stillness. This closeness was more than practical, it nurtured a sense of peace. In a world where winter could be unforgiving, this simple act of gathering together offered assurance that they would face the cold not as individuals, but as a united, resilient whole. The fire hummed on, and the room settled into a deep, tranquil quiet. It was the kind of silence that encouraged tired eyes to drift shut, that allowed the mind to soften and drift toward rest. The hours after midnight were often the coldest of all, and medieval families knew this well. Even while bundled together beneath layers of wool and sheepskin, someone always kept a gentle ear tuned to the hearth. To let the fire die completely meant waking to a cold so sharp it could sting the lungs and numb the fingertips before a person even rose from their bedding. Tonight, the fire had burned low, its flames shrinking into a cluster of glowing coals that shimmered like rubies beneath thin layers of ash. Their warmth was modest but steady, radiating outward in slow waves that warmed the nearby stones and drifted softly through the air like an invisible blanket. The father stirred first, not fully awake, but not truly asleep either. Winters taught people to rest lightly, listening for small shifts in temperature. Without lifting his head, he listened to the quiet pulse of the room. The embers crackled softly, but their sound had grown thin. It was time. With a slow, careful movement, so as not to disturb the children curled beside him, He eased himself up from the bedding. The sheepskin slid back slightly, releasing a brief puff of warm air that mingled with the cooler air above. For a moment, the contrast made him shiver, but he moved deliberately, used to this nightly ritual. The room was dim, lit only by the faint red glow of the hearth. Shadows pooled softly in the corners, unmoving and peaceful. The fire's light reflected gently on the hanging herbs above, giving them a soft amber outline that made them look almost alive in the stillness. He reached for a small wooden poker resting near the stones. Its handle was smooth from years of use, its end darkened from countless nights of raking embers. Kneeling beside the hearth, he used it to gently shift the coals, revealing pockets of brighter heat beneath the ash. A soft stream of warmth rose from the newly awakened embers, brushing his face with quiet relief. From the woodpile, he selected not a large log, but a thin, dry branch, just enough to feed the fire without causing it to flare too brightly. Light at this hour was meant to be soft, calming. A roaring flame might warm the cottage, but it would chase away the sleepfulness the family needed. He placed the branch carefully atop the glowing coals. For a moment, it simply rested there, motionless in the dimness. Then the embers reached up with thin fingers of orange, catching the wood's edges. A tiny flame began to curl around the branch, growing slowly, as though waking from its own slumber. The father watched for a few breaths, ensuring the fire would take. The faint crackle that followed was gentle, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby for the night. Behind him, the mother stirred slightly, sensing his absence. She opened her eyes only halfway, her voice a soft murmur in the dimness. "Is it holding?" she whispered. He nodded, even though she could barely see him. "It will last," he whispered back. Reassured, she settled again into the warm cocoon of blankets and straw. Her hand brushed absently over the children, checking that they were still deeply tucked in. Their small breaths rose and fell steadily, completely undisturbed by the quiet tending of the fire. The father returned to the bedding with slow, steady steps. He slid carefully back beneath the wool layers, his body welcomed instantly by the warmth preserved there. The sheepskin settled over him once more like a soft cloud. Within moments, his breathing blended into the gentle chorus of the room. The fire, now softly revived, cast a low orange glow along the floorboards. Outside, the snowfall thickened again, laying down fresh layers of quiet across the village. The wind had grown mild, whispering past the cottage in long, slow breaths. Inside, the family slept on, wrapped in warmth, watched over by the steady glow of embers that would hold them safely through the long hours until dawn. The night pressed on, slow and unhurried, as though time itself had curled up beside the sleeping village and decided to rest a while. Snow continued to drift down from the cloud-covered sky, each flake joining countless others that had already settled on rooftops, fences, and fields. By now, the weight of winter blanketed the land in thick, shimmering white. The cottage's thatched roof bore its share of the snow, the dense reeds holding firm beneath the cold load. Over the years, the family had learned how snow could settle unevenly, bending older beams or slipping through small faults in the thatch if not tended to each season. But tonight, the roof held well. The wintry hush softened every surface, the snow acting like a quilt pulled gently over the village to keep it calm and still. Inside, the warm breath of the fire had created a faint contrast. Frost flowers spread outward on the parchment window, delicate and intricate like lacework. They formed branching, shape-curved lines, feathery patterns, and icy spirals each, one glowing faintly in the dim firelight. The window had become a canvas of winter artistry, its chilled edges sparkling like tiny crystals. From time to time, a soft thump would sound above the family, a small mound of snow, sliding off the thatched ridge, loosened by subtle warmth rising from the cottage. The sound was gentle, not startling, more like a sigh from the roof, settling into comfort. The children, wrapped in layers of wool and straw, barely stirred at these sounds. They had grown accustomed to winter's quiet language. The mother, half awake, opened her eyes just enough to listen. She had an instinct for winter sounds, able to distinguish between the slide of snow, the groan of a beam adjusting to cold, and the distant rustle of wind. Each noise told her something about the night. Tonight, everything she heard reassured her. Nothing strained, nothing cracked. The cottage rested soundly, holding them in safety as steadfastly as the winter sky held the stars. She shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the children nestled between them. Her hand brushed over the sheepskin's warm, weighty surface. Beneath it, the straw bedding rustled softly a comforting sound that blended perfectly with the low crackle of the fire's revived flames. The father, still mostly asleep, breathed deeply beside her. His breath rose in faint white wisps in the cool air before fading. Each exhale added a bit more warmth to the little world beneath their blankets, creating a shared pocket of gentle heat. Outside, the snow deepened so thickly on the rooftops that the village appeared almost swallowed by winter. Only the faint glow of a few hearths hinted at life within. Around the cottages, fences and tools stood as still as sculptures carved from frost. In the nearby fields, rows of frozen earth lay beneath their icy covering, sleeping through winter's length until spring's first thaw. The old plough leaned gently against the barn wall, dusted in soft layers of white. The well's wooden frame stood silent, its bucket frozen in place for the night. Yet no part of the cold felt threatening. The village seemed cocooned beneath the snow, the weight from above pressing only lightly, as if winter itself intended no harm, only a deep, quiet pause. Inside the cottage, the fire's glow shifted again, casting a warm hue along the wooden beams overhead. The shadows wavered in slow movement, drifting like soft breaths across the ceiling. The hush in the room seemed to deepen, settling into a peaceful stillness that invited rest, reflection, and the slow drift of dreams. Wrapped in warmth beneath the layered blankets, the family slept safely while winter rested gently atop their roof, holding them like a guardian through the silent hours until dawn. The moon, veiled earlier by drifting clouds, began to show itself through a thin break in the night sky. Its pale, silvery glow spread quietly across the snow-covered landscape, giving the village an otherworldly softness. Every rooftop gleamed faintly, every frozen path shimmered, and every tree cast long, delicate shadows across the fields. It was a cold light, but a peaceful one, calm, steady, and watchful. Even inside the cottage, though the parchment window muted the moonlight, its presence could still be felt. A subtle, cool radiance brushed the edges of the room, mingling with the warm embers until the space felt balanced between winter's chill and the hearth's gentle heat. The mother stirred first this time. She didn't wake fully, but her senses, shaped by many winters, reached outward. She listened to the softness of the fire and the faint movement of the wind outside. Everything was quiet, so she allowed herself a deeper breath, slow, restful inhale that soothed her from within. Beside her, one of the children shifted slightly in their sleep, turning so their cheek pressed against the wool blanket. The movement caused a soft ripple of warmth to travel beneath the layers, the kind of warmth only people sleeping closely together could create. It was comforting, like a small reminder that no one faced winter's cold alone. The father remained still, resting with a steadiness that came from knowing the home was secure. His earlier tending of the fire had done its work. The branch he'd laid had burned into a snug cluster of glowing embers. They lit the room with a dim but reliable glow, just enough to keep cold from creeping into the corners. Outside, the moon continued its slow climb. The snow caught its light and sparkled gently, as though sprinkled with tiny fragments of glass. The village carts, leaning against fences, looked like quiet silhouettes. The wooden buckets near the wells had frozen solid hours ago, their surfaces now covered in a delicate glaze of frost. Near the barns, the animals rested in their own circles of warmth. The cows, huddled together for shared heat, breathed slowly into the straw bedding beneath them. Their breath formed soft clouds that drifted upward before fading into the cold air. Chickens nestled on their perches, feathers fluffed against the cold. Even the barn cats, usually independent and aloof, curled together into a warm knot of fur near the hay. The village as a whole seemed to hum with a silent togetherness, every creature, every cottage, connected by the shared experience of winter's long, still night. Back inside, the mother opened her eyes just a little more, noticing the faint glow along the window's edge. She couldn't see the moon directly, but the quality of the light told her it was bright tonight. A small smile touched her lips. Winter moons were often seen as quiet companions, distant but steady, a reminder that light still existed even in the coldest hours. She gently adjusted the blanket over the children, tucking the corners so the warmth stayed sealed inside. The soft rustle of fabric blended with the low hum of the fire, creating a soothing rhythm that seemed to cradle the entire room. A moment later, she settled back down beside her family. The warmth beneath the blankets welcomed her immediately, wrapping her in the soft embrace of wool. straw, and shared breath. Her eyes drifted closed once more, comforted by the peaceful glow that filled the cottage. Outside, the moon continued its quiet watch over the village, patient and calm. Inside, the family slept beneath its serene glow, held safely in the embrace of winter's nocturnal peace. Morning light came thin and pale, barely strong enough to push through the frost fog clinging to the tree line. By the time the sheriff's truck rolled up the hill, the house felt colder than the snow outside. Not the physical kind of cold, something heavier, like the air itself didn't want to move. Deputy Keller was the first one to notice. "There," he said, crouching by the porch steps. "Fresh tracks." At first glance they looked like normal footprints, until you realized they didn't sink, not even a millimeter. Perfect outlines atop the untouched powder, as if whatever made them wasn't heavy enough to disturb snow at all. The sheriff followed the line of prints with a slow exhale, tracing them from the porch, across the yard, and straight into the woods. But that wasn't the strangest part. There was only one set leading out of the forest, none going in. Keller swallowed. "Sheriff, those prints are heading toward the house." The sheriff didn't respond. His eyes had locked onto something else, something half buried under a thin veil of rime. A small shape hanging from the railing, a charm, handmade twine loop, 3 tiny bells, the same kind hikers sometimes leave to warn off animals. Except these bells weren't meant for animals. They were meant for something else entirely, something every old-timer in this region knew better than to name aloud. The sheriff reached for the charm, but the moment his glove touched it, all 3 bells shook on their own. No wind, no vibration, just a soft, metallic tremble, like a warning delivered too late. "This," Keller whispered, stepping back, "this isn't normal." The sheriff didn't disagree. In fact, he looked as though he already knew what had left those impossible tracks, and why it had come back. Inside the cabin, the sheriff closed the door behind them with a firm shove, as if he expected something to be waiting on the other side. Frost dusted the window panes, even though the wood stove had been burning since dawn. The fire crackled, but it didn't warm the room much. Deputy Keller paced near the kitchen doorway. "Sheriff, we should call for backup, at least alert Fish and Wildlife. Whatever made those prints wasn't any animal," the sheriff said sharply. Keller froze. The sheriff rubbed a hand over his face, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Fresh powder, no weight in the snow, single direction. I've seen that before." He paused, glancing at the frosted window like he expected to see a silhouette behind it. "Last time was 20 years ago." Keller swallowed. "The old case, the one they told us not to bring up." The sheriff nodded once. "It starts with sounds in the trees," he said quietly, "soft at first, like a faint bell. Then you find charms twine, little trinkets, bone, sometimes metal left, where they know you'll see them. After that come the footprints." He tapped the toe of his boot anxiously. "Always one set, always leading toward the house." The room fell silent, except for the steady hiss of snow sliding off the cabin roof. Keller finally spoke. "So what does it want?" The sheriff's eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the far bedroom door that had swelled slightly overnight, the wood warped by cold. "It doesn't want the house," he said. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "It wants whoever left it alone last time." The house creaked faintly just once, but clear enough that all 3 of them turned their heads. The sheriff reached for the doorknob of the back bedroom as though bracing himself. "Before I open this," he said, "I need you both to understand something. If what I think is in there, then this isn't a trespassing case. It isn't an animal attack. It isn't even a missing person situation." He paused, hand hovering over the door. "This is something that doesn't like to be ignored." The wind outside stopped, completely, as if the whole forest was listening. The sheriff eased the bedroom door open, and a long, tired sigh of cold air slipped out, brushing past them with the faint scent of pine and something older, almost metallic. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the silvery wash of morning snowlight filtering through the frosted window. Dust motes drifted lazily in the cold beam, rising and falling as though the room itself breathed. No one spoke. No one moved. At first, the room appeared untouched. A simple bed with wool blankets, a small wooden chest at its foot, a tiny table with a single candle that had melted sideways, frozen in a curve, like a droplet caught mid. Everything was exactly where the owners, long gone, had left it. But the sheriff stepped deeper into the room with a heaviness that told them he had expected something more. "Look at the corner," he murmured. Deputy Keller turned slowly, his breath fogging. In the far left corner where the shadows gathered deepest, something hung from the ceiling beam. A charm, but not like the ones outside. This one was larger. A rough circle of thin branches, bound in tight twine that looked older than the house itself. Draped from it were strands of wool, braided with dried berries, and Keller leaned closer. Small stones scratched with tiny marks like faded runes. The whole thing swayed gently, though there was no breeze, not even the slightest draft. "That wasn't here when we searched the place yesterday," Keller said softly, stepping back. "No," the sheriff replied. "It wasn't." A low creak trembled through the wooden floorboards, one that came not from beneath their boots, but somewhere deeper, lower, as if the cabin had stirred in its sleep. The sheriff crouched beneath the hanging charm, studying the symbols with a wary familiarity. "They put this here for a reason," he said. "Back then, the family thought it kept the presence out of the room. But," he exhaled slowly, "it's here now." Laurel hugged her arms around herself. The cold in the room had sharpened, the kind that felt less like winter and more like being watched by something patient. "What does it mean that it put the charm here?" she whispered. The sheriff didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the faint scratches on the floor, tiny grooves, like something had been dragged in a slow circle around the room. Once, twice, over and over. "It means," he said quietly, "that it doesn't need keeping out anymore." As he stood, the charm overhead gave a soft, rhythmic ticking sound, like the slow swing of a pendulum. Tick, tick, tick. But the charm wasn't moving. The ticking faded as quietly as it began, leaving the room wrapped in a stillness so complete that even the old timber walls seemed to hesitate before settling again. A soft pop of cooling wood echoed from somewhere overhead, followed by the faint rustle of snow sliding from the roof. The sheriff let the silence stretch, as though the cabin itself needed space to exhale. Laurel took a slow step toward the window. Frost had feathered across the glass in delicate pattern sweeps and spirals that looked almost intentional. She lifted a finger, but stopped just before touching the pane, sensing how deeply the cold pressed through it, how the winter outside almost seemed to be leaning in. Deputy Keller moved softly along the opposite wall, examining the faint circular scratches on the floor. Up close, they seemed even older, worn gently into the wood rather than carved sharply, as though something had traveled that path, not once, but many times, tracing patient arcs through the years. "The family who lived here," the sheriff said at last, his voice low. "They always claimed the house reacted to it before they ever saw signs. Doors swelling, corners going cold, lights dimming even when the fire was strong. They believed it wasn't the creature haunting them, but the cabin trying to warn them." Laurel glanced around uneasily, as if the house knew. "Maybe not knew," the sheriff replied, "but remembered." Keller straightened. "Remembered what?" The sheriff ran a hand along the wall, his fingertips brushing grooves left by generations of winters. "There was an old story, even before the family, about the first settlers who came through these woods. They built a shelter here, almost in this exact spot, because they said the forest felt watchful, but safe, as long as they stayed respectful of whatever lived beyond the ridge." He paused, listening to a distant groan of wind pushing against the window. The charm above them gave a soft twitch, its wool strands brushing lightly together with a whispering sound. "But one winter," the sheriff continued, "one of them went out past dusk, farther than they should have. And after that night, the group wrote in their journals that the forest no longer felt like a place they were allowed to stay." Laurel frowned gently. "What happened to them?" "No one knows," the sheriff said simply. "Their shelter was found empty by the next passing group in spring. Food still there, tools left out, firewood stacked neatly, quiet as if they stepped outside and never came back." The cabin creaked again, soft, almost sympathetic. Keller shifted, trying not to show how the story had settled beneath his skin. "So, you think whatever came for them, came back?" "I think," the sheriff said, "that the forest has rules. Most winters, those rules lie quiet. But some years," he looked toward the window, where snow continued to fall in light, steady patterns. "Some years it asks to be remembered." A gentle thump sounded from somewhere deep within the walls, not threatening, more like the heavy settling of an old structure adjusting to the cold. Yet all three of them turned toward it at the same time. Laurel spoke first, her voice just above a whisper. "Sheriff, if the house is remembering, are we supposed to remember something too?" The sheriff didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped toward the door, running his hand along its frame. "That," he murmured, is what we're going to find out before night comes." He opened the door, and a warmer wave of air from the main room eased the chill from their skin as they stepped out slowly, like leaving a place that had been holding its breath. Behind them, in the empty bedroom, the hanging charm gave one last, faint tap against itself, then silence. The main room felt warmer than before, as though the wood stove had suddenly remembered its purpose and pushed a deeper glow into the cabin's old bones. The fire crackled softly, each ember rising like a drifting orange firefly before fading into the chimney's dark throat. Laurel moved closer, rubbing her hands together, letting the quiet warmth settle her breath. The sheriff crouched near the door, brushing snow from the entryway rug. The snow had melted in small patches, leaving darkened circles where something cold had rested only moments before. Keller's brow furrowed. "We haven't opened this door since we came in." The sheriff didn't answer immediately. He lifted the rug gently. Underneath, the wooden planks bore a faint, pale imprint, not sharp like a footprint, but more like the memory of one. A smudge shaped by something lightly pressing against the floor, something that didn't carry much weight at all. Laurel knelt beside him, her breath catching softly. How does something leave a mark without pressing down? The sheriff placed the rug back carefully, smoothing it with a slow pull of his hand. "Same way frost forms on the inside of a window," he said, quietly, without force, "just because the air wants it there." The cabin offered its own soft reply, a gentle rattle of the stovepipe as the wind outside shifted direction. Keller moved to the window overlooking the tree line. Outside, the world looked muffled and softened, snow drifting in a calm, steady curtain. The forest no longer felt threatening, only watchful, like a great sleeping creature breathing under a white blanket. The morning light, thin and diffused by clouds, gave the woods a silvery calm. Keller spoke without turning. "It really is beautiful out there." Laurel joined him. The trees were dusted in perfect layers. Branches waited gently under the fresh fall. No movement, no shadows between them, just the serene hush of winter settling deeper into the land. It looked untouched, peaceful. But then Keller leaned a bit closer to the glass. "Laurel, sheriff, look at the edge of the tree line, half hidden by drifting flakes." A small shape hung from a branch, a charm, not the looping complex ones they'd found earlier, but a simple twist of twine with two short feathers tied into it, delicate, almost harmless, but it hadn't been there moments ago. The sheriff came to stand behind them, his shadow soft in the dim light. He studied the charm as though trying to read a message written in a language only Winter understood. "That's new," he murmured. The charm swayed gently, though the forest around it remained still. Laurel watched the feathers flutter with a slow, graceful motion, almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. "What does this one mean?" she asked quietly. The sheriff exhaled slowly, crossing his arms not protectively, but thoughtfully, like someone remembering an old song. "It means we aren't alone out here," he said. But his voice softened. "It also means it isn't angry." Keller turned sharply. "Not angry, no," the sheriff replied. "If it wanted us frightened, it would keep its distance. Whatever this is, it's letting us know it's close, and watching. That's not always a threat." A long crackle from the wood stove filled the silence, the sound warm and steady. Laurel's shoulders eased just a little. "So, it's communicating maybe," the sheriff said. "Maybe it's just reminding us to pay attention. Winters like this. The forest wakes up old habits." The three of them stood quietly, watching the charm sway in the snowlight. No fear, no, only curiosity wrapped in the calm of the falling flakes. Outside, the wind gently shifted again, brushing the charm in a soft arc. Inside, the cabin felt warmer still, as though settling into its role as their shelter, their lookout point, their quiet companion in the long winter day. As the morning deepened, the light outside softened into a muted silver, washing the cabin in gentle tones that made every wooden surface seem older and kinder. Laurel drifted toward the table by the window, tracing her fingertips along the grain of the pine. The old cabin felt almost alive, now settled, listening, peaceful in its own creaking way. Keller pulled a chair near the stove, letting the warmth rise around him in lazy waves. His boots thawed slowly, leaving small wet shapes on the hearthstone that steamed faintly. The smell of warming leather mingled with the scent of burning spruce, filling the room with a scent that felt grounding, familiar, quietly comforting. The sheriff remained at the window, his silhouette steady, thoughtful. Laurel followed his gaze. The charm outside had stopped moving entirely, hanging as motionless as the trees around it. Snowflakes drifted past in slow spirals, each one unique, each one briefly catching a glimmer of soft light before melting into the white drifts below. "Sheriff," Laurel said softly, "you said winters like this wake up old habits. What did you mean?" He didn't answer at once. Instead, he opened the window latch, slightly, not enough to let the cold in, just enough to hear the faint murmur of winter beyond the glass. The forest responded with a long, low sigh, like air moving through distant branches. "When the first families lived here," he said gently, "they paid attention to the seasons, not out of fear, but out of respect. They believed that in deep winter, when the snow muffled all the noise and the nights stretched long, the land itself grew more aware." Laurel listened, resting her arms on the back of a chair. "You think the land is aware now?" "Maybe," he said, a faint smile touching the edge of his voice. "Or maybe we're just listening better than people usually do." Keller leaned back, eyes half closed. "It does feel different today, like the quiet has layers." Laurel nodded slowly. She heard it know beneath the gentle hush of snowfall, beneath the stove's soft crackling. There was another sound, a faint, delicate hum. It wasn't music, not exactly, but something like wind passing through long-forgotten corridors. "What is that?" she murmured. The sheriff tilted his head, as though reacquainting himself with an old memory. "It's the same sound they wrote about in the journals," he said. "They called it the winter whisper, said it showed up just before something changed." Laurel leaned closer to the window. The charm outside gave a tiny twitch, not a sway from wind, but more like a brief shiver, a subtle vibration, as if responding to the sound. And then they heard it again, soft, short, like a breath drawn in the snow. Not a voice, not a word, just a gentle exhale from somewhere out beyond the tree line, calm and unhurried, like something settling deeper into rest. Keller straightened slowly. "You think that's it? The thing we're looking for?" The sheriff didn't look alarmed, only contemplative. "I think," he said, "it's letting us know it's nearby. And I think it wants us to understand something before nightfall." Laurel's eyes softened with a strange mix of unease and curiosity. "What would it want us to understand?" The sheriff's answer came quietly, almost reverently, that the forest remembers who listens. The wind outside rose again, gentle, stroking the charm so it spun once, lightly. Inside, the cabin remained warm and calm, the quiet hum deepening, settling around them like a blanket. The afternoon light mellowed into a softer gray, the kind that made every shadow smooth and unthreatening. Laurel wrapped a wool shawl over her shoulders as the sheriff moved toward the door. Not hurried, but with the calm purpose of someone following a familiar rhythm. Keller rose as well, brushing warmed pine needles from his coat where the scent had settled. "We're going outside?" Laurel asked gently. "Just a little ways," the sheriff replied. "If it wanted us afraid, it would have stayed quiet, but it's showing us signs. That usually means it wants us to follow." Laurel hesitated, but the thought of the forest softened by snow, hushed by stillness, felt less frightening now, more like stepping into a cold dream where every sound carried meaning. The sheriff opened the cabin door. A wave of crisp winter air flowed in, cool but not biting, almost refreshing. The snow just beyond the porch was smooth and powdered, untouched except for their own boot prints from earlier. The charm at the tree line swayed faintly, as though acknowledging their presence. The three of them stepped out together. The world outside was wonderfully quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, but full of the sound of their slow breathing. The soft crunch of snow underfoot, the distant whisper of wind threading through empty branches. But then Laurel saw it. Not 50 feet from the cabin, just beyond the first drift, the snow seemed shaped as though brushed by an unseen hand. A faint, winding trail pressed lightly across the surface, not deep like footprints, not sharp like tracks, but smoother, like something had glided over the snow rather than walked. Keller crouched beside it. Whatever made this barely touched the ground. The sheriff nodded, studying the delicate marks. "It's always been like that. Too light to break the crust of snow, too careful to leave a full footprint, as if it's moving through a memory of the forest instead of the forest itself." Laurel touched a gloved hand to her chin thoughtfully. "Where does the trail lead?" The sheriff pointed ahead, where the faint line curved between the pines, weaving gently toward the old ridge. "It's guiding us." Laurel followed his gaze. The ridge rose quietly above the forest, coated in thick white layers. From this angle, it didn't seem menacing, just ancient, patient, a place that had watched many winters come and go. They walked slowly, savoring each step, listening to the steady rhythm of their movement. The farther they followed the faint trail, the more the sounds of the cabin faded behind them. The forest grew still again, but not silent. Rather, it murmured softly beneath the snow, a hush of tiny sounds that felt like the trees breathing. Halfway to the ridge, Laura paused. "Listen," she whispered. The sheriff and Keller stilled beside her. Somewhere ahead, a faint tapping echoed, gentle, steady, like someone knocking lightly on wood. Not hurried, not urgent, just a small, patient reminder. Tap, tap, tap. Keller glanced toward the sheriff. "Is that it?" "No," the sheriff said quietly. "That's the sign." He pointed again toward the ridge. "Something wants us to see what's waiting just beyond those trees." Laurel took a slow breath. The air felt crisp and soothing in her lungs, mixing with the soft scent of frozen pine. Instead of fear, a strange calm passed through her, as if the forest's steady quiet had settled into her chest. "Should we keep going?" she asked. The sheriff looked at her, then toward Keller, then finally toward the winding trail that continued forward like a thread drawn across the snow. "We should," he said softly, but slowly, respectfully. The tapping continued, gentle as a heartbeat, guiding them onward, and together they walked through the snow toward whatever the winter wanted to share. The closer they came to the ridge, the more the landscape seemed to exhale around them, soft clouds of wind drifting from between the trees, carrying the faintest scent of cedar and something older, something untouched for a long time. Snow lay thick on every branch, bending them into graceful arches that formed a natural passageway leading deeper into the forest. The tapping sound faded, not abruptly, but gently, like a conversation that had ended because it had said everything it needed to say. In its place settled a peaceful hush, the kind that sits over a place where time feels slower. Laurel paused at the edge of a wide clearing. Here, the snow was different. It lay in smooth, circular patterns, as though shaped by long movements of wind or, perhaps by something drifting lightly in slow circles. The surface glimmered faintly, tiny crystals catching the muted light and letting it shimmer like a pale silver pool. Keller crouched again, brushing his glove over the snow. "It's warm here," he said softly, surprised. Laurel knelt beside him. He was right, the snow wasn't warm exactly, but not as sharply cold as the drifts behind them. It felt like a place where winter had settled gently, as if it treated this spot with a kind of reverence. The sheriff reached the center of the clearing and stopped. "This is where they found the last tracks," he murmured. "Years ago." Laurel rose slowly, her breath a thin cloud in the calm air. "What happened here?" The sheriff didn't speak immediately. He looked around the clearing with a long, thoughtful gaze, like someone revisiting a place full of memories that weren't entirely their own. "The family used to call this the listening ground," he said. "They said that when something ancient passed through, it paused here, not to frighten anyone, but to remember those who paid attention." Laurel felt a quiet ripple move through her, not of fear, but of wonder. "Do you think it's still doing that?" The sheriff nodded. "I think that's exactly what it's doing." Keller stood, brushing snow from his knees. "But why show us this?" "Because," the sheriff said softly, "the forest always teaches in slow ways. It doesn't rush, it doesn't push, it just guides." Laurel tilted her head, listening. There beneath the silence was the softest hum again, a gentle vibration underfoot, like distant water moving through frozen earth, subtle, comforting, steady. She walked a few steps forward, and then she saw them. Not footprints, not tracks. Marks in the snow barely, their spirals, perfectly round and smooth, as though something with no weight at all had circled through the clearing.